A man bites down on a strip of leather and fixes his eyes on the ceiling of a saloon. The person standing over him with a blade is not a surgeon. He is a barber, maybe, or a man who watched someone else do this once, in a muddy field during the war. The nearest building that resembles a hospital is 5 days' ride away if the weather holds, and the wound is already turning wrong. Welcome back. My name is Clay, and today we are going into the documented truth of medical care in the American Wild West from 1840 to 1890. What it actually looked like, who was providing it, and why a perfectly healthy man in his 30s could lose his life to something as ordinary as a broken bone. If this channel is new to you, subscribe now. We deal in history the way it actually happened. Let's get into it. Between 1840 and 1890, if you were injured or fell seriously ill on the American frontier, your survival came down to one question: who happened to be nearby? Not who was qualified, not who was trained, who was physically present. Because on the frontier, those were two entirely different things. Before the 1860s, and in many areas well beyond that, almost any man could call himself a doctor. Licensing requirements were minimal or did not exist at all. Several states had passed medical licensing laws and then repealed them under pressure from the public, who saw them as elitist interference. There were no national standards. A man could read a medical text, apprentice with a practicing physician for a few months, and hang a shingle on his door. Some never went through even that much. They simply decided one day that they were doctors, and since nobody had the authority to tell them otherwise, that is what they became. The medical schools that did exist were largely unregulated. Many had no affiliation with any hospital. They required no student to witness a surgery, examine a live patient, or perform any procedure before being handed a diploma. Instruction was almost entirely lecture-based. In the 1830s and 1840s, the penalties for practicing without a license were quietly removed across much of the country, opening the door to what historians have described as an unregulated medical marketplace, a free-for-all where the difference between a trained physician and an ambitious fraud was, in practice, almost nothing. A man might graduate from one of these schools without having stood in the same room as a sick person. And then he would travel west, where the demand for anyone with medical knowledge was high enough that nobody was going to ask too many questions. The typical frontier doctor carried everything he owned in a pair of leather saddlebags. His basic kit included homemade cloth bandages, a mortar and pestle for grinding and mixing preparations, a few glass syringes, a small collection of knives in various sizes, and a bone saw. By 1840, a well-equipped practitioner might add a stethoscope, tooth forceps, and some obstetrical tools to the list. A few carried a device called a pulsometer, a glass container filled with colored liquid that produced a stream of bubbles when the patient held it while his pulse was taken. It revealed nothing medically useful whatsoever, but it looked impressive, and in a world where confidence was often the most available medicine, appearances carried real weight. The drugs these men carried were a different matter. Through the 1830s, the standard arsenal consisted almost entirely of narcotics and purgatives. Calomel, a mercury compound, was prescribed with alarming regularity as a general cleanser of the body. It caused heavy salivation and, with sustained use, softened the gums until the teeth began to fall out. Ipecac was used to induce vomiting as a form of treatment. Quinine, which was genuinely effective against malaria, did not become widely available until the 1840s, and even then, it was expensive enough that in 1846, one Indiana physician sold a herd of cattle at $7.50 a head simply to afford a supply. What is important to understand is that this was not the West producing uniquely bad medicine. This was standard American medicine of the era, carried to the frontier wholesale, where isolation stripped away even the modest safeguards that existed in larger cities. In a city, a patient could seek a second opinion. On the frontier, there was no second opinion. There was whoever showed up. And whoever showed up might be a barber, might be a blacksmith, might be a traveling salesman who had read a few pamphlets and decided that was enough. The documented record from Denver tells of a physician named Dr. F.J. Bancroft, who once performed an amputation while a man held a weapon on him, threatening to use it if the patient did not survive. Bancroft performed the operation anyway, steady hands throughout. The man lived. But that is the world these practitioners inhabited, one where the line between medicine and sheer desperation was invisible most of the time. The isolation was the real enemy, not just because it kept trained help at a distance, but because it put the patient in a state of helplessness that is difficult to fully imagine today. A rancher who broke his leg in a fall from a horse might lie in a bunkhouse for a week while someone rode for help. If an infection set in during those days, and on the frontier, infection was nearly guaranteed, what started as a fracture could become something far more serious by the time anyone arrived. The frontier did not give a man the luxury of time, and time, even with the best medicine available, was the one thing that could not be replaced. The Civil War changed American medicine in ways that took decades to fully understand. Between 1861 and 1865, Union surgeons alone performed nearly 30,000 amputations. Men who had never operated on a single patient before the war had performed hundreds of procedures by the time the fighting ended. They became fast, they became practical. And when the war was over, many of them headed west, carrying skills that were genuinely useful, and a blind spot that was going to keep killing people for years. The skills were real, hard-won, field-tested, and by the standards of the time, impressive. What they did not bring, because no one had it yet, was any understanding of what caused infection or how to prevent it. Louis Pasteur's germ theory would not gain widespread acceptance in the medical community until the late 1860s and into the 70s. Joseph Lister published his antiseptic surgical methods in 1867 and was met with widespread resistance, even hostility, from physicians on both sides of the Atlantic. The surgeons who came west from the war knew how to remove a limb cleanly and tie off blood vessels efficiently. They did not know that the unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments they were working with were introducing something into every wound that was more dangerous than the original injury. A standard surgical kit of the era, the kind a traveling frontier physician or military contract surgeon would carry, contained an amputation saw, amputation knives of several lengths, a tourniquet, bullet probes for locating lead, forceps, a set of needles and suture thread, and some basic dressings. Anesthesia existed by this point. Ether had been introduced in 1846, chloroform came shortly after, but access to either on the frontier was inconsistent. A physician, far from any supply route, might have none at all, and without it, the patient was held down by however many men were available. For pain management outside the operating context, the primary tools were laudanum and whiskey. Laudanum, a dark, bitter liquid made from opium dissolved in alcohol, was available without a prescription at any general store or pharmacy. Doctors prescribed it for gunshot wounds, snake bites, toothaches, migraines, cramps, diarrhea, and general anxiety. Frontier druggists stocked it as a standard item, right alongside flour and nails. It was dispensed broadly and freely, with little understanding of what sustained use would produce. The Civil War had already created a generation of veterans dependent on morphine and opium. Addiction was common enough by the post-war years that it had acquired its own informal name, soldier's disease. Those same veterans settled the frontier, and the same habits followed them west. The problem with laudanum in a frontier context was not only addiction. It was that it provided enough relief to allow a man to delay care he desperately needed, to convince himself the wound was manageable, to put off getting help until the window for any useful intervention had closed. A man who took laudanum for a deep puncture wound might feel well enough to sleep, wake feeling worse, and by the third day be past saving. The bottle that dulled his pain also dulled his sense of urgency. That combination was not uncommon, and it was deadly. Beyond laudanum and whiskey, the frontier pharmacopoeia was a mixture of the genuinely useful, the ineffective, and the actively harmful. Quinine worked for malaria. Opium worked for pain. Calomel, still in use well into the post-war period, caused mercury poisoning in patients who received it long enough. Doctors mixed their own preparations with a mortar and pestle, combining ingredients with no standardized dosing, no quality control, and no reliable way to verify that what they were administering matched what they believed they were giving. There was also the matter of what doctors believed was happening inside an infected wound. A wound that produced thick, white pus was considered a good sign. The pus was called laudable, meaning it signaled a localized infection unlikely to spread. Thin, bloody discharge was the sign of something worse. These distinctions were real in a clinical sense, but the cause was entirely misunderstood. Surgeons observed the yellowish fluid coming from a healing wound and concluded the body was simply cleaning itself out. They did not understand that the pus was the evidence of a battle against bacteria they could not see and did not believe existed. And so the basic precaution that would have saved lives, cleaning and sterilizing the tools before the next patient, simply was not taken. In Denver, Dr. Bancroft's experience with the armed brother was not the only documented case of frontier medicine conducted under informal threat. The records left by these physicians are full of moments where the boundary between medicine and raw survival is barely distinguishable. Men operating in candlelight on kitchen tables. Men setting compound fractures in bunkhouses during blizzards. Men making in minutes the kinds of decisions that today would require a hospital team and several hours. The training they had was incomplete by any later standard, but many of them showed up anyway, and a portion of the people they reached would not have lived through the week without them. Where frontier doctors were absent or simply inadequate, which was often, other forms of medicine stepped into the space they left behind. Chinese herbalists were among the most significant of these practitioners. Chinese immigrants had arrived in large numbers during the gold rush of the 1850s, and they brought their medical traditions with them. Every immigrant who made the crossing typically carried some herbal medicines in their luggage. The herbalists who settled in mining camps and railroad towns served not only the Chinese communities, but increasingly white settlers and cowboys who had no other option and were not in a position to be particular about the source of their care. One of the most thoroughly documented of these practitioners was a man named Ing He, who operated out of a stone building in John Day, Oregon, a frontier gold mining town, from 1887 until well into the 20th century. Known locally as Doc Hay, he became so trusted that patients traveled from Utah, Nevada, Idaho, and as far as Northern California to see him. When his building was later preserved and reopened as a museum, officials found over 1,500 herbal prescriptions still on file, and, more strikingly, uncashed checks from patients totaling $23,000. Ing He appears to have simply chosen not to cash them, knowing his patients could not afford to pay. He left behind containers of 500 separate herbs, only 200 of which had been formally identified by the time researchers began examining them. Harvard Medical School and the University of Alabama both expressed interest in studying what he left behind. Another documented figure was Dr. Yi Feng Chung, who treated patients out of his store in Fiddletown, California. These men were not operating on the margins. They were central to the health of communities that Western medicine had no practical means of reaching. In gold fields and railroad camps, where no licensed physician was within a week's travel, they were simply the medicine that existed. Native American healing traditions filled a related role, though in different ways. Plains tribes had developed extensive plant-based knowledge over centuries, including treatments for infected wounds, fever, pain, and conditions that frontier settlers encountered regularly. When settlers found themselves without a doctor, some consulted indigenous healers, though willingness to do so varied widely depending on the individual and the state of local relations. George Catlin, the artist who documented Plains Indian life in the 1840s, noted that every tribe had what he called medicine men, practitioners who served as the intersection of spiritual care and physical healing, and who commanded deep community trust. The practices were not identical to Western medicine, and the underlying philosophy was fundamentally different, but the practical knowledge of plants, their applications, and the management of infection and injury was often genuinely sophisticated. Neither Chinese herbal medicine nor Native American healing was miraculous. Both had real limits, but they were serving populations that Western medicine was failing, either because it was physically absent or because what it offered was, in practice, not reliably better. A frontier physician who prescribed calomel for a digestive problem was not obviously more effective than an herbalist who prescribed something that would not also corrode the patient's gums. Because the fundamental problem of Western frontier medicine in this period was not effort or intention, it was knowledge. Specifically, the absence of one piece of knowledge that would have changed almost everything: where infection came from and how to prevent it. Once a wound became infected on the frontier, the options narrowed quickly. If the infection spread to the blood, it was almost always fatal. The records of Civil War medicine show just how catastrophic infection could be, even in a context with hundreds of surgeons and organized supply chains. On the frontier, isolated, with one man and a saddlebag, the outcomes were grimmer still. And what do you think? Could you have survived something like that? A bullet wound, a broken leg, or a spreading infection in the middle of nowhere with the nearest help days away? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. The change, when it came, did not arrive overnight. It came piece by piece, over the last 2 decades of the 19th century, driven by a combination of population growth, religious initiative, institutional ambition, and the slow, grinding accumulation of evidence that things needed to be different. The first civilian hospitals in the American West were small, underfunded, and typically built and staffed by religious organizations or community groups who recognized the need before any government body was prepared to act on it. In Salt Lake City, Episcopalians opened St. Mark's Hospital in 1874. 2 years later, the Roman Catholic Sisters of the Holy Cross established Holy Cross Hospital in the same city. The Mormon Relief Society opened the Deseret Hospital in 1882, which included a nursing training program, one of the first in the entire region, where up to 6 women per year were trained in nursing and obstetrics. In Galveston, Texas, John Seeley Hospital opened in 1890, eventually becoming part of the infrastructure that supported the first medical school in Texas when the University of Texas Medical Branch opened the following year. These were not yet the institutions we would recognize today. They were often sparse in their resources, staffed by people who were learning as they went. But they represented something genuinely new: the idea that there should be a dedicated place with consistent standards and trained practitioners where people could go and expect to receive some version of reliable care. The reform of nursing was central to everything that followed. During the Civil War, over 20,000 women had volunteered in hospitals on both sides of the conflict. They had done the work. They had seen what the work required. In 1869, the American Medical Association commissioned a formal report on the training of nurses. The report, prepared by the eminent Civil War surgeon Samuel Gross, concluded that carefully trained nurses were, in many cases, indispensable, that they could, as Gross put it, do much to correct the errors of an ignorant or careless physician. Trained nurses began arriving in frontier hospitals through the 1880s, bringing with them protocols for wound care, hygiene, and patient observation that even resistant physicians gradually adopted. One figure worth naming here is Romania Pratt, who trained at a medical college in the East and returned to Utah in 1877 to establish one of the first formal medical training programs in the territory. She and other women who entered medicine during this period were not exceptional in intelligence or determination. They were exceptional in that they had access that most women of the era did not, and they used it to build something lasting. The American Medical Association had been founded in 1847 with the stated purpose of raising medical standards nationwide, but its influence reached the frontier slowly. Licensing laws, where they existed, were inconsistently enforced. A man could still call himself a doctor in many parts of the West well into the 1880s. But the pressure was building. Towns were growing large enough to sustain permanent institutions. Railroads were making trained physicians from the East more mobile. Germ theory was becoming impossible to ignore even for the most resistant practitioners, and the documented, observable evidence that antiseptic care produced better outcomes was accumulating beyond the point where any reasonable physician could dismiss it. The shift in understanding about infection was the single most consequential change. Once surgeons began sterilizing instruments, washing their hands between patients, and treating wounds with antiseptic solutions, mortality rates from surgery dropped in ways that were immediately and dramatically visible. A wound that previously would have killed a patient within a week now had a reasonable chance of healing cleanly. For the frontier, where infection had been the single greatest killer across half a century of settlement, this was not a minor advance. It was the difference between medicine that routinely failed and medicine that sometimes actually worked. By 1890, the landscape had shifted. Not completely, not evenly, but perceptibly. Hospitals existed where none had been a decade before. Trained nurses staffed them. Licensing requirements were beginning to acquire real teeth. The era in which any man with a saddlebag and a confident expression could claim the title of physician and operate on his neighbors was, slowly and imperfectly, coming to an end. The men and women who had lived through the earlier decades, who rode 4 days for help that turned out to be a man with a saw and a bottle of laudanum, or who lost a child to something that would be treated with a simple prescription today, never got to benefit from what came after. But the record they left behind in journals and county death registers and the archived case files of frontier surgeons made the argument for reform impossible to ignore. The history of medicine in the American West is not a story of ignorance. It is a story of people doing the best they could with what they had in a place that gave them very little, against odds that required no exaggeration. If any of what you heard today sat differently than you expected, a case, a detail, something that made you stop, drop it in the comments below. We read every one.